Tatsala. Oh, it does work. Oi, Kaloma. Wenakisa Beth Piatot. I'm the director of the Arts Research Center here and associate professor of English and Comparative Literature. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here today. Welcome, poets, Craft Talk. Woohoo! What could be better? What could be better? We have such a beautiful day for it too. I would like to say that Esther Berlin's visit is part of a collaboration between the Arts Research Center, the Department of English, the Lunch Poems series, and has support from the Berkeley Library, the Morrison Library Fund, and the Dean's Office for the College of Letters and Sciences. As you know, poet Esther Berlin gave a beautiful reading at Lunch Poems today. It was recorded, so if you had class during that time, you can always go back and check the recording. It'll be up in a few weeks. So we're really looking forward to reliving that beautiful day.
Thanks.
But for now, we're going to have a beautiful craft talk. Our speaker today, Esther Berlin, is a multimedia artist and the author of award-winning books of poetry. I would like to pause for a moment and point out one of her mixed media visual arts is on our poster. So this is part of a new series that Esther has recently completed. So please take a poster with you and also check out our other events. And thank you, Esther, for allowing us to use your beautiful work. That's only a small, these earrings are also made by Esther. It's like, I could go on. She can do everything. But just to talk about this stack of books first. Her first book, From the Belly of My Beauty, was recognized with an American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation. She's also author of the acclaimed volume of Cartography. And today at Lunch Poems, we were privileged to hear from both of those volumes as well as from some of her new work. In addition to her own work, Esther is a generous teacher, mentor, friend, and editor to other writers and artists. She currently teaches at Fort Lewis College in Native American Indigenous Studies and is a faculty mentor in the Institute of American Indian Arts Creative Writing MFA program. She sits on the board of INAPO, a new nonprofit dedicated to uplifting Indigenous poetics and language. Esther has guest edited Poetry magazine with a focus on Indigenous poets, and she served as one of the co-editors of the beautiful Dene Reader, a volume dedicated to Dene writing. This work also received an American Book Award, so great work all around. So we are proud that she is a graduate of UC Berkeley. Yes. Go Bears! I never do that, so I'm glad it's on tape. I went to Stanford, but for this, go Bears. She also holds degrees from IAIA and Antioch College. Among her recent honors, she has been named the first ever Poet Laureate of Durango, Colorado. So much to appreciate today. So now I will invite Esther to take the stage, and she will present her craft talk. And then I will return, we'll have a conversation and Q&A from the audience. So please, everyone's got their notebooks out already. What am I saying? Just be ready for your own questions and participation in the conversation. So please join me in welcoming Esther Berlin, who will share her talk, Dene, Land, Sound, Scape as Poetics.
Yay. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Beth, and everyone involved in bringing me out here. It's been a real warm welcome, and it's actually been really good for me as an alum to kind of come back on campus and see things and just relive that. I really loved walking. I mean, it sounds corny, but through Sproul Plaza and just seeing all the students, and because I sat out there doing different things, and so that was really fun to do today. Esther Berlin Yanishya loge dene nishle, Twitter chitni bashes chin, Kitler chitni dashache, Tad chitni dashanella, Akot ego dene asan nishle. And that's the very kind of typical Navajo introduction, which connects me to not only my family, but also really helps kind of orient and place me in a geography to the land and also to other tribal members. And as I talk about language and soundscapes, I'll be using the metaphor of rug weaving, which is kind of a craft, I guess, art that Navajo, primarily Navajo women, participate in. And so it'll be kind of, I guess, more visual, like pulling in concepts from several scholars. And then I'll show some of my creative work on how that was sort of displayed visually. And the concept I'm going to be kind of grounding to is this idea of reterritorialization, which has been present with me for the last few years. And philosopher Jill Giles, it's a French name, Deluge, and psychoanalyst Felix Guattari coined that term, deterritorialization, to indicate a fracturing of, a debordering of arrangements. And that could be conceptual, social, political, or linguistic. An example of that would be colonization. Reterritorialization expresses the transformative and creative potential of making new connections, linkages, becomings, and assemblages between and counterpoint to deterritorialization, which can indicate decolonization. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So the linguistic phenomenon of deterritorialization and reterritorialization are where my interests most lie. As described by Deleuze and Guattari, the two concepts stretch out on a spatial continuum and evolve from each other's absorption. And similar to contrapunctal geographies, so when thinking about language and its absence, and I'm not sure that's the best phrase, when we think about language loss or the absence of language, so using those concepts, some of the questions, at least in my own studies I've had, is language really lost, or has it just been debordered? And then how does one acquire language in that fragmented form? How does the lexicality of language arrangement itself position itself in that debordered status? And this is so essentially my own study of my tribal language use, which has been going on probably since I was here at Berkeley, where I really started getting into ideas and concepts around language. Before I was introduced to Deleuze and Guattari's concepts, I was introduced to the work of Anishinaabe scholar Gerald Visner, who was here at the time when I was at Berkeley. And he introduced concepts of survivance, which is very well known these days. He also introduced other concepts relating to Indigenous social identity. His vocabulary included terms such as word arrows, cross-blood, comic holotrope, comic chants, comic discourse, interior landscapes, among many others. And while Deleuze and Guattari used deterritorialization and reterritorialization to represent states of becomingness, Visner fashioned uses of the trickster trope found within Indigenous storytelling and philosophy to theorize about states of becomingness, belongingness on a spatial continuum he describes as trickster discourses. I first learned of Visner's work, like I said, while a student here, and I took his literature class, which really wasn't a literature class. It was, I mean, it was just this wild kind of journey of texts. Yeah. And so when Deleuze and Guattari began, and so this is the interesting thing. So Visner's, I was introduced to his scholarship like in the late 1980s, although his scholarship began much earlier. And Deleuze and Guattari started doing their partnership scholarship in that same era. So I don't know if they knew each other or that it was kind of related, but it's really an interesting kind of connection there. And Visner uses linguistical shape-shifting descriptions for trickster, comic narrative, language game, comic holotrope, and an interior landscape. These identities involve land and sound geographies that tease readers into a settler colonial fantasy of mythic Indians. So about Trickster, Visner states, the most active readers become averse tricksters, the waver of a coin in a tribal striptease. And so when Visner talks about this striptease, he's really talking about a lot of the things that kind of are circling back in this idea of performativity, and how through the settler colonial lens, there has been created what he calls this mythic Indian, right? And so a lot of times people become characters in that. And so we can see people who perform as mythic Indians, who play into a lot of those tropes. And so that space kind of in that, where I was talking about the linguistical shape shifting space, that's really where I'm going to be focusing a lot of my material today. And yeah, so Visner very much speaks to Indigenous rhetoric and agency in that sense. And I know more people are just starting to write about Indigenous rhetorics, but a lot of that, I mean, Visner was writing about this like just early on. And because he uses this trickster format of writing, his writing was really difficult, and it was inaccessible to most people who really didn't want to dive into it. And so now I think people are just really starting to kind of see the layers in there. And so as Trickster is in play, there occurs a re-territorialization of land and sound, which can be the language. And to use Sherwin Bitsui, who is another Navajo poet, his reference to describe Trickster, when I was talking to him about language and language use, because he learned Navajo as a first language, and he would describe English as a guest language, like he's a guest using English. So for him, it's very easy to move the furniture around, talking about English, letters and reordering structure. And when we've had conversations about using Navajo language, even though that's his first language, he very much was so reverent of the Navajo language. And he was just like, even putting it on paper, he wasn't even sure like if that's right. Not that if it's allowed, but if that would be a way to, like the translation of the sacredness of the language, he was unsure if it would translate once it became sort of flattened on paper. And so it's really an interesting, right? But he kept saying, but for English, like they welcome us to move the furniture around. It's okay to sort of, bastardize it, if you will, right? And use it that way. And So reordering logic, language, the listener, reader, can become part of Wisner's interior landscapes. So that, again, that's one of the phrases he uses to describe Trickster. And quote, the listeners and readers become a trickster, a sign, and semiotic being in discourse. The trickster is a comic holotrope in narrative voices, not a model or tragic figuration in isolation. Everyone, everything present in that interior landscape becomes, quote, semiotic beings in discourse, end quote. The entirety folds into Trickster's comic narrative language game, where Trickster is actually an experience. So I think when a lot of, and Wisner's hilarious when you really understand what he's writing about. I mean, he includes in a lot of his writings anthropologists who have written about Native American creation stories or what they call myths, and he uses them as characters in his interior landscape. And so Trickster is because it has that shape shifting quality, right? It can be sort of like human like, but it also can represent the rhetoric, the actual action of what's happening. And so that's how because he doesn't really pin down in all of his writings. Wisner never really says that Trickster's this, it kind of definitive. It's more like it's this and this and this, and it just keeps going on, this list of qualities. And so Trickster in that sense is definitely an experience, right? So, and part of being a careful listener helps us understand what part of that experience we are experiencing, which is really in sync with another writer, First Nations scholar Dylan Robinson, his strategy in hungry listening, where it's the practice of decolonial listening moves us beyond settler listening fixations, where we're no longer a hungry listener, or in Wisner's words, we no longer need to perform socio-acupuncture, which he describes as a therapeutic tease and technique as a mythic strategy for survival. So he's saying that when Native Americans are in that sort of performative mode, we have to perform on ourselves socio-acupuncture, right? Which is, again, he describes as a therapeutic tease and technique. So that's sort of, in a way, a kind of a self-care practice in that, again, that shape-shifting idea around that mythic strategy for survival. Robinson encourages an indigenous epistemology of listening, reclaiming dispossessed spaces, re-territorializing the sonic scapes, if you will. The shift allows us to understand positionality as interior landscapes. Robinson's decolonial listening sinks to Wisner's Trickster, who heralds a, quote, communal signification, end quote, where signifiers are acoustic images bound to 4 points of view: the author, narrator, characters, and reader, which essentially is like a simulation. And when fully observed in the absorbed spatial continuum, the striptease assembles itself to be in the eye of the comic holotrope, the interior landscape. Okay, so that's enough of all of them. So this is where I'm going to introduce how all of this kind of intersects with the sound and landscapes. So my relationship with Diné sound began as a child. My mother often held me close, funneling the lyric rhythms of Diné Bazad into my ear. And those sounds of my language calmed me. They transported me back to Diné. I would translate that sound of the language, and immediately my homeland would become vivid, acoustic images. And I still find comfort in listening to the soundscape of Diné Bazad. And now, after many years of listening for sound or its absence, I have a form of active relationality through memory that exists with the language. So using language brings me home because the sounds and images come from my tribal homelands, the soundscapes. Indigenous language borrows sound from the land, including silence, form, and thought. It is from a land sound-based context that language poeticizes, echoing sounds of home. It is also upon the return to those soundscapes that the foreign status of indigenous sound dissolves. The release relaxes our throats and softens our tongues to our creator-given languages as we decolonize our listening. So no longer will indigenous sound contort into settler sounds and letters that subjects us to colonial epistemic violence and undermines indigenous ontology. So an example of that would be right now for the Navajo language, and I think most tribal languages, if we want to write in our language, we're using English orthography, English letters and sounds. So we're just kind of putting our sound into a little colonial structure of sound. And so what it does is, it continues that violence, and it continues sort of mixing up or making intranslatable our language. And I think there's two tribes right now. I know the Cherokee have their own syllabary, and the Osage have just created their orthography. And so there's still a need for indigenous linguists to start figuring out how to create their own sound in a visual orthography, so that we can better learn the language, or learn it as we sort of received it from the land. So re-territorializing our storing spaces serves a catalytic role in destabilizing settler narratives. The territories of inquiry demand a cognitive code mixing, where cultural memory plus new sonic knowledge production equals many of the linguistical shape-shifting descriptions, wordplay, comic narratives, geographizing poetics. A land soundscape where knowledge is situated, a relational connection. And many tribes already have this concept. For the Navajo, it's called which is this relationality, sort of reciprocal word, where we're just connected to things. And you see it in the language, just examples and examples over and over again. And code switching is one way writers make these relational connections. And there's a couple of sociolinguists, Ahmad Kabaha and Bilal Hamamara, noticeable in many of people exiled from language is the use of code switching, they say, where language text as home is a recurring trope, an adherence to national belongings, and it is a sign for the author's struggle toward self-definition, which is based on intersubjectivity for the lost past, which is homeland or community, recaptured through their strategic use of code switching. Literary code switching reflects not only linguistic and sociolinguistic elements, but also the aesthetic and literary. an idea that opens into indigenous linguistic artistry, literary sovereignty. And I would say historically, the U.S. literature canon included Native American literary contributions, mostly for an aesthetic contribution. And if we see it that way, it's an extension of that hunger for that performative striptease from the mythic Indians in literature. And it confirms the placement of Native Americans in colonized spaces rather than an invitation to change that field of literature. And I think right now we're at that place where we have enough Indigenous writers where they're actually changing that field. And they're what I call that literary sovereignty, where they're really investigating and being critical of the way their language has been violenced and really responding to that, but also changing so many things. And the beautiful thing is it's happening with poetry. As more writers write from a literary sovereignty position, and emergence of hybrid linguistic identities unfold. And that's an event described by linguists Daniel Weston and Penelope Gardner-Kloros, which I don't see that hybrid linguistic identities as multiplicity or plurality. I see this as distinct linguistical textual planes because of the poetics and perhaps meta-languages. And again, cycling back to Sherwin Bitsui, who speaks to this idea, well, there is a figurative return to homeland written in the language of the place of exile. So according to Edward Said, exiled people cultivate an exilic consciousness and they perform what he calls contrapunctal thinking. Quote, because the exile sees things both in terms of what has been left behind and what is actual here and now, end quote. Said utilizes a discourse of displacement that renders exile status a condition of creativity, compounding on thoughts from another linguist, Theodor Adorno, who says, for a man who no longer has a homeland, writing becomes a place to live, which leads to the exile status that can be seen in boarding school children. And I like to say that the boarding school children who attended the earliest of boarding schools were the first generation of creative writers. I'm indebted to those little ancestors. During the cultural assimilation process, they infused indigeneity into a system designed to extract and destroy. A significant body of creative writing examples come from boarding school poetry, often found in archives, hidden, and now just being recovered very recently. Poetry was used as a method to teach Native American students how to master the grammar and syntax of the English language. Not only did those students grasp those concepts, but they also coded their own tribal poetics into their creative works. And currently I'm teaching a Dene Poetics at Fort Lewis College, and we're reading a lot of that boarding school literature. And it's really fun to have the students kind of, and a lot of them are Navajo students, to kind of see that language come alive as you're reading those works. These young children were among the first to, quote, cultivate exilic consciousness, end quote. As we study their writing, we can experience what they experience, both the exilic state and the actualization of what is here and now. In their exile state, creative writing becomes a place to return home, which is actually the title of the text The book that we're reading is called Returning Home, Diné Creative Works from the Intermountain Indian School, which was in Utah, edited by Farina King, Michael Taylor, and James Swenson. So I acknowledge those early creative writers as my inspiration to re-grammar Indigenous sound and order into my poetics while using the English alphabet. So starting for me to look at systems that we're locked into, and I started examining positionality to understand what's being asked of me, not only as a person, but also mostly as a writer, right? And then what's being consumed. So I don't know if this is a rejection of institutional or settler systems, because the idea of territories being absorbed into one another, it kind of describes this vaporous interconnectedness, which has allowed for Indigenous epistemology to gain ground. And that's that concept of re-territorialization, right? So we only, in terms of memory, right, we have that memory and of colonization, which allows us to then kind of reform and recreate that creative space. And there's also a nudging of the people to reimagine. So there's an argument that Indigenous creation stories are alternative realities narratives, that we just need to go back to those narratives. And for the Diné, our stories are land-based, and seeing the land as a linguistic device is necessary. So we're threading into other Diné writers' thoughts on land. One of them is Jake Skeets, who talks about land is form and memory, that land maps personhood and interior personal spaces. Dinepazad, the Navajo language, is verb-based. That centers on moving energy, the sound, the word order, quote, language verbs the poem into motion, end quote. And that's Jake. And in 2010, I heard Sherwin give a talk, Sherwin Bitsui, and he was saying that truth varies in poetics. The flux is where the truth lies. And at that point of motion is where Bitsui suggests that we sink into this time print rather than speak at it. So what he says readers need to sink into language and soundscape, he reiterates Skeet's concept that land is form and continues the nudging of decolonial listening by going back into our creation narratives. And at that time, Bitsui spoke about how, and I love this part, how he kneads his poetic, like kneading like bread. And then he like folds it and unfolds it. And as he does that, he folds and unfolds the images. And then he like also flips his images like a fry cook. And so I think those are really good tools to help you while you're reading his poetry, because many people have tried to describe his poetry or try to classify it. And I mean, it's really interesting because I've read those and I'm always thinking like they are missing it. They're just kind of and so even when he's talking about language and understanding how the Navajo language is used, it really gives you that image, that tool on how to kind of find his interior landscapes. And he also talks about that, interior and exterior spaces, where there is no glossary for the interior spaces. He says there is a pause for exterior spaces. That is the moment of flux, the tension between coding and cognitive shape shifts, the moment where we are instructed to sink into this time print, to participate in a trickster discourse. And because of that pause, which I think, as I'm learning the Navajo language, they have a glottal stop, which kind of like stops everything. And I always think of that as the pause. And they actually, in the language, they consider the glottal stop a consonant. And many other languages do too, and so it's easy to rush over, right? And especially in that idea around Dylan Robinson, if we're hungry listeners ready to consume the next sound, we're really going to miss it. And so how, thinking about all of this, thinking like, well, how do I put my poems in motion? How do I use verbs or kind of create some of the things? I have a list here of things that I do. I think about our relationship to knowledge and teaching and the individuals who share that knowledge with us. So understanding those qualities of stories, ancestral, sacred living, which is tied to the language, which kind of goes back to what Sherwin was saying about this idea of the sacredness around our language. And those relationships are not just with objects, but with subjects, they're with the community, and then there's consideration around ethics of storytelling and revealing, finding different ways and writing about different ways of being in relationship that creates no harm, right? And I think that's the biggest thing for a lot of Indigenous writers about what's shared and what's not shared now, and kind of more narrative, typical narrative writing. And I think only within poetics can you create I guess a more difficult poetics, a more difficult writing where the readers actually have to work at it, right? If they want to, and when that happens, what it does is it creates an equity, right? So it's no longer I'm this consumer, I'm just going to be a voyeur on this dance, but I'm going to have to kind of dig in what Sherwin talks about, that imprint, right? And just peer into that and experience it. And then once I experience it, then we can actually maybe have a conversation that's more equitable, where it's not like you just tell me everything about your tribe or tell me everything about your stories, right? Because you see the other person having to work for it on the page. And a space to practice that craft in different forms, and how we include and identify what is a Diné aesthetic, which is dependent on the individual interpretation. There's an individual Diné-ness, if you will, which you'll see. So it's not a standard. And I mean, within Native Lit, it can't be, because right now there's like over 500 different Indian nations that are recognized by the government, more than aren't. And so when you have that diversity of language and their experience with sound, I mean, you can't have like a Native American genre, right? And that's part of that violence, where it's just like, oh, here's the typical, oh yeah, for Native Lit, here are like the 4 qualities of it, right? Which I think is still more commonly known around Native literature. And a question here, how does our contribution as writers contribute to Diné literary sovereignty? And I'm not really even talking about the oral literacy part of it, because still a lot of tribes use that orality, the storytelling, and there's different devices, there's different poetic devices, which kind of goes more into like the indigenous rhetorics of storytelling. And so part of it, then how does that change once we take the orality of the story and then kind of flatten it on the page? And Robinson's idea around civilizing attention, which I think is really interesting, right? That idea of, and so that draws away from the land and culture. And that can happen once we put it in print, if you will. So one of the things, right, that the settlers' descriptor of Indian tribes was that they were uncivilized because they didn't have a written language, or they weren't fluent in another written language, right? And so then we're kind of taking that idea now, where he's saying, if we do put it on here, in a way, it takes away our attention, so then we don't have to listen anymore. And so that's a really beautiful quality, because I think there's still, I mean, right now we're kind of in that balance of, because some tribes truly don't want their language written. They want it all to be kind of passed on through speaking it. Robinson also talks about these ideas of mobile attention or mobile listening, where indigenous mobility, movement based on relationship, the spatial quality of listening, which the settler views as detriment or primitive. And and another question I had for myself was, how do we filter sound from land, using land as a poetic device? How does it shape our words, order, layers? How does it create lightness or opaqueness in the writing? Can we separate from the colonial gaze and its hungry designs? How do we listen without extraction? How does that practice shift structures of feeling? So the other thing too about Indigenous languages, I feel, is that there's a feelingness. Like I think that feeling emotional quality to language is a poetic device, right? Like there's something about it that's so tangible. And how do we, or how does that practice then shift and then affect also the settler ear, right? So the last question, what is the historical relationship between sonic and visualized stereotypes and in literary and racialized spaces? So, so during all of this, kind of study on these things, I just end up actually having this big list of questions. And then I just kind of create from there. And that's where a lot of the art comes from. So this is actually mountains that are just like, I don't know, half an hour from where we live. And this is one of our boundary mountain in the north. And so we go there for, and generally our boundary mountains, we have 4 big ones and then 2 smaller ones, and they're typically just used for like pilgrimages, right? We go there and there's kind of a cycle in direction which we go. And so this is the northern one, which I live by. Here's another image of it. And right now it's actually just full of snow. It's so beautiful right now. And so then this next one is kind of an art piece that I created off of that idea, right? Of the land sort of creating the form. And the 2 kind of cut out pieces and sewn in the middle are an ocean scape. And these come from, and my daughter Sierra is here with me right now, but she might remember because her and her sisters used to show their art at the Santa Fe Indian Market, which is a big art space in Santa Fe every year. And one year, this man, a non-Indian guy, came up and he gave us these big old giant boxes of paintings. And he goes, oh, I have these canvases. No, he called them canvases. I have these canvases and can you use them? And they were all, I think, his, or he found them somewhere. And so what I did was I reused the frames, but I cut out the image. But then I thought like, oh, I'm going to use those old canvases and kind of reorder them. And so these are some of the older canvases that I reordered. And here's another one. And so I did them different ways. I cut them in strips and I sewed them together. And then I also left them outside and I kind of just like rubbed rocks on them and I kind of just let them, like I still have 2 right now sitting outside that are just kind of, experiencing, right? And that I'm going to reuse. Here's another one. And then that one I kind of flipped and I added on things like there's sand from where we're at. There's seeds on this one. And then this one, taking the shapes of the land around there and kind of abstracting some of those shapes, where the idea was that, you know, land becomes the narrative, right? And then writing from that place. And so then these are, I'm going to have a series of pictures I'll go through kind of fast that are all around either on the Navajo reservation or near. Yeah, and then this is what are in terms of boundaries, right, or borders. This is what our land looks like. And so you might be able to see, yeah, Durango. So that's where I live, up there. And so it's interesting, right? I think we're the only tribe that has another Indian tribe within its borders. So you can see within there, there's the Hopi reservation. And even that's been contested. And so these are borders, of course, that the US government has created for us in our land. And this is another image of abandoned uranium mines on or near the reservation. And so when we think of sound and think of space, land as form, one of the things, so these 3 pictures I'm going to show were from the first series, but these are all basically abandoned uranium mines. So it's hard to distinguish, right? Because it's become so part of our memory that this is what our land looks like. And so you would see these and you would like, oh, that's just part of the reservation. But those are actually like abandoned mine sites that have now kind of eroded, because how they covered them was they basically just covered it with sand and gravel and small rock. And that was over 50 years ago. So a lot of erosion has happened since then. And so one of the things that I started looking at with language was abstraction and iconography, especially when I think of performance, going in Gerald Visner's ideas, and how when we talk about that trickster discourse, these are all kind of descriptors that can occur if we say, you know, I'm Native American or I'm Indian, or even if I'm Navajo, right? So depending on who we're talking to, we can be in all of these different realities, and it can be at the same time. And then I started looking at photographs, like documents. These are Native American students in boarding school. And it was interesting, right? Because this is what they wanted to document. And one of the things I picked up in here was this idea of order and line, right? They put them very much in a performative space of being in order, being in line, being all uniform. And then this sort of before and after pose. And even both of them, they're kind of like leaning. And this is an image from the same time period and the same school that my mom went to. And so this is typically kind of what happened, right? They part of, by the time she was in boarding school in the 1950s, they were really pushing on domestic household work for them to be more domestic subjects in different homes around the LA area. And this was in like a yearbook. And so then started writing to some of these pieces and really thinking of going back to that model around that abstraction and that iconography, right? So kind of then placing some of my writing to that. And so a lot of this was really bringing in ideas around cultural memory, geographical memory, and scarred memory. So then doing, bringing in conversations and therapeutic work around recovery from intergenerational trauma. And this is another look at our land. And this is more of when we consider what the Navajo land is, this is sort of our region, and a closer up one. So we have Navajo people were one of many tribes that had forced marches, and then we were taken to a prison camp, which was at the Bosque Redondo. And they literally forced them to march like over 300 miles. And you could see a couple of the routes went by Santa Fe, and they forced them, like paraded them through town in regards to a defeat. And so how does that play into the writing as well? And then this is, so we're starting to get more abstract into the maps. And so then this is a poem that's of cartography, and the numbers, relocate as needed, really speaks to the federal policy. How I ended up in Los Angeles was the federal policy of relocation and termination of Indian tribes. So those numbers indicate the different relocation kind of moments. And again, that idea is needed because we're in this narrative that's not ours. And then another poem that came from that was this idea around, and I use the X's because, as a symbol, it represents like the unknown, but also it's identifiable, like it's an entry point for people to sort of work out this problem, right? And which, when people talk about problems, really, if you go through federal policy and so much of federal legislation, they talk about the Indian problem. I mean, they use those exact words. And so then here, again, that idea around creating equity in terms of conversation, right? So sometimes when I do workshops, I'll have students like, okay, do the assignment, right? And they're just like, what? And part of it is, again, to experience, this is what it was like in boarding school for these Native students to learn English. It was like, here, this is your name. Here, this is what your instructions you're supposed to do. Right. And it was just like they had to like reformulate and quickly like remap, that cognitive kind of jumping around. And so that emotional kind of instability is really what a lot of, a series of my writing was about, right? For people to really kind of experience that visually. And then this one too, this one plays with, so for around gender, for the Navajo people, we really believe like we have two meridians that kind of run vertical. We have a left side that's male, a right side that's female. And so using that in that marker as well. And then having another assignment, right? Find the complementary points and to plot them and to create some kind of visual text. Like, so you add all these elements, so you create that context. And so rather than saying, okay, I'll be that mythic Indian, I'm saying, no, here's the elements to your story. Here's what you say we are. You go ahead and do that, right? Like you figure out what that is. And sort of releasing some of that agency. And this is a poem actually that was inspired by UC Berkeley. After a while, right, I think, I was a first generation college student, and, my parents didn't have experience with all these forms, and every single form, they just wanted to like put you into a smaller box and a smaller box. And just it really did something to me. And I just kind of flipped that on here because the more and more it's like, tell me your story, the more and more it's like, I really want to hear the violence in your story. And then that kind of re-traumatization of self. And so then kind of flipping back. So this is essentially a visual representation of the Navajo cosmology. This is a framework for our philosophical thinking, or a philosophical framework of just living. And then these last images are from art installations, group shows that I've done. So then taking that fragmenting, another fragmenting the visual, that idea of order. And those are just cotton cloth that are kind of soaked in reservation mud, earth. And then these kind of images of right, like the damage from all of these, right? When we talk about what it's like to experience these and to kind of go through this is sort of the remnants. And this was like a kind of a word thing that I did for the installation as well. But that idea of scrambling, like, right, how can I find myself within all of this, these letters? How do I exist? And then this was from a show that was on the pandemic. It was a portal. So it's basically a portal between worlds. For the Navajo, the first world is kind of where we originated, like where all our original teachings are. As we keep going up, the black is kind of chaos, right? And so this represented that idea that it's fluid. We can go both directions, right? And then the elements on the bottom kind of create like some of the original teachings as well. So when we go down, we're gonna have landmarks there that'll kind of help us, direct us. And then this is the piece that is on the poster. And I think, yeah, it's kind of hard to see but this was the idea around relocation, right? And using the sheep, which was one of our, Navajo people are herds people, they still are. So it's that kind of idea of dividing up that sheep and kind of that violence around that, and then just taking chunks and placing them in urban centers. And I might be going too long, but I have, so this piece is more recent. The idea around weaving things together. So these are more of those canvases that I cut up and was resewing and reframing, and kind of, again, that idea of putting them on display. And then these, I'm gonna kind of go through these a little fast. This was part of a series that I finished last summer, and Beth helped with this. These were posters that were part of a show around Borderlands. And so the missing kind of speaks to the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives that is getting a lot of attention in the last few years. The writing, so what I did was I asked people I know to write a description of me if I went missing. And then I used my silhouette. And then the land for sale one was, I had people write a description of their homeland that is so precious to them. And then what if it went for sale, like $1 an acre, right? Which was what happened to surplus Indian land after people came in and just, so when we talk about, land grab, that's really where that is. And so all of those are different places in the area. And thank you. But that's it.
Wow.
So there's a lot.
Cuts you out. Yeah, that. You gave us so much to think and talk
should
about.
we turn this off?
We do have a few more questions because I want to give the audience a chance to.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Use. I will just ask just one or two questions.
Sure.
This is kind of a question about like, what do you think poetry is or does? And I remember you opened up by talking about rug weaving, and
Yes.
there's this idea that, well, sometimes people will look at a Navajo rug and say, like, what does it mean? What do the symbols mean? And then sometimes the answer to that is, well, it's not really about, it can be about the design, but it's not necessarily about the design.
Yes.
It's about seeing the wood of the loom and the wool of the animal and the labor of the person all united.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, that's such a beautiful way also to think about poetry. And so I wondered if you could pick up on that a little bit. Like, so what is it that you're looking at when you're looking at a poem, or what is it that it is made of, or what does it do in your practice?
Yeah, I think one of the things I definitely do is, because of that visual space of a poem, I look at it as a landscape, right? So I really do pay a lot of attention to the form, but then also the sound of it, because I think there's lyrical qualities to almost all poems, right? So there's some kind of sound kind of coming out of there. And so really kind of understanding then how do they kind of weave all of that together, right? How are they using the space of the actual page as a device as well, right? Because I think you hit it right there when you think of that form, because the rug really can only become a rug based off of what type of structure it has, right? And so I think there's a lot of elements to that. I mean, even if like the tension on some of that yarn warp is off, it really affects the whole piece. So there's that kind of uniform. So when, and I think that's the really great thing about like a wonderful poem that you love, is that it's all together, right? Like, so if you took something out, it would just be like, oh no. And so that, and I don't know if I want to say completeness, but it's just all, it feels like everybody's in the room that needs to be there, right? Like all the elements are in the right place for that.
Yeah. And that also has the interdependence and interconnection that you opened your talk with. So I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to turn to the poets in the room to ask more. So you've talked a lot about like what's on the page, but what I also noticed in your work is that you use the whole keyboard. So I want to know how, like what is the piece that moves the other parts of the keyboard onto the page for you?
Yeah, well, and I really appreciate that. So, and I think it was years back when I did that triangle about the abstraction and the iconicity, right? Like that idea that we, and then also my studies around because I kept thinking, how did my parents learn English? What was that experience like? Because I know so many students struggle just with writing or comprehension or and I was like, well, how did they learn? Right. And I know there was definitely like force and coercion going on, but my mom, not so, I mean, my dad too, my mom, dad, and then my aunt and uncle who all like lived in the LA area. my aunt and uncle, who were really close to me. I mean, they could all read and write fairly well. I mean, so their boarding school took them up to about 8th grade education. And so I never thought like it, and this is interesting, right? In my cognitive, I thought, oh, they're illiterate because they didn't go on to high school, they didn't graduate. But in reality, they weren't. I mean, they could read. My uncle was a great reader. You know, and I remember seeing letters from both my dad and they could write. It wasn't like broken English. The grammar was fine. But somehow in my brain, I just connected, oh, they're illiterate because of this and right. And so I think that idea between how we give things meaning, and that's where I really kind of throw those other elements out for the readers to kind of like, well, you give it a meaning. Like, what does it mean to you, right? To really kind of incorporate, because I know what it means to me, but I think it also can, and I know that there's multiple meanings. I know it can mean this, I know it can mean that, right? And I think there's also a little bit of where I want the reader to engage. I'm like, you know, if you really want to know what, you know, Navajo poetry is, then you kind of have to dig a little harder. I'm not going to make it very, you know, easy.
Wonderful. I'm going to open it to the group. If you have comments or questions, we have a couple minutes.
Yeah.
So.
I know.
Thank you. That was just such a brilliant talk.
Oh,
I want to read it and I want to sort of savor it and just learn, you know, learn from you and think about some of the analogies, the problems on the page with the coordinates. And I love how you described giving it back to the person who it belongs to. It reminded me of James Baldwin's line, like, I don't even like watermelon.
Yeah.
I am not your Negro type of thing. And just the you know, it's just such a necessary move, I think, to find different ways of handing that back to the people who have the constructs. And I love the problems, the way that you've kind of materialized it in math and the kind of like vexing nature that so many of us have with like the grids and all of that.
Yeah.
And so it's this layered problem. And yeah, like we're all problemed.
Yeah.
And like here's your problem back that
Yeah.
you've imposed on to me. But I was also very curious about like language itself. You used a word, I think it was like something having to do with the connection in DNA to objects. I'm probably not saying it right, but there was
Okay.
like
Yeah.
a moment where in the language is like, you're like, there's all these examples. And I love that. And I think I want to think more with that. And I speak some languages, and sometimes I see that stuff happening, but we don't emphasize it in English for all the reasons we can imagine, right? Just our connection to anything, right? The individual and like the way that English has evolved here in particular. So I just wanted to hear more about like some of those examples and how you work them into your poetry, if you do.
Oh, yeah. So for the Navajo language, and I want to say every language, every indigenous language, the more I talk to people about their tribal language, the more I'm like, oh yeah, it's the same. And in that it's, so Navajo is a verb-based language, and it's also relational in the grammar. So when you talk about things, or it's really describing things. And so, you know, my mother-in-law, she teaches, she's a retired teacher for Navajo language, but she's always talking about what they call handling verbs. And those are verbs that are used to describe things. And so, So based off of the sentence, you're not just going to call like this a table, but you're going to talk about the rigidness or the hardness of it or the use of it and the relationship of me to it, right? And the same thing with like water or something squishy. I mean, so we have so many verbs that describe like texture and rigidness and hardness. And I think she was saying there's like 36 ways to talk about an object, right? And how they do it. And the reason, like, I think it's so funny is because the more they talk about the object, so they have the root here and they can add on all these, it's like a big giant run-on sentence almost, and it just adds on all these qualities and qualities and qualities, and you can keep going and going and going, and then after a while it just becomes funny because you're talking about a table and it has all these qualities and you're just like laughing. And so that's one thing, but then there's also the play with sound. So then you can talk about, so when I was reading earlier, talking about the ha. So ha can be just like here. But you could say ha'i to mean like, well, what is it? You could say hahale to talk about like a point or an origin. Or, and so just that one sound can be like all these different things. And so that's, and it reverberates. It like has this meaning. And I'm still learning the language, but I think the hardest part about learning it is, again, because it's written in English and it has like these diacritical marks that I don't, and it's interesting, my husband, well, he'll look at sometimes Navajo language and he'll be like, he's trying to read it. And he's like, I don't know what that is. And then when he hears it, he's like, oh, that it doesn't sound like that, right? Like that's not the connection there. So I think that's the biggest kind of barrier right now. But that's that kind of, we're talking about that relationality to, and also I guess another example would be where Sherwin was talking about like where he doesn't want to use the Navajo language or have it in print. But then there's another poet, Rex Jim, who writes only in Navajo, but he writes these really short poems that are all about sound. It's just sound poems, like true, like pure. And it's funny. They're just funny because of the sound. And if you know what it is, it's kind of hilarious. And yeah, and I guess that other, so, and then Layli Long Soldier, like I've heard her talk, she's a Lakota writer, about how she started using her Lakota language in her poems, but then after a while she'd look at it on the page and she's like, I can't believe what I did to my language. She's like, it's sitting there, right? And all these like, English letters, and she goes, I'm just oppressing it. Like, I don't want to continue, that make it. So she has that feelingness to her language, and she's like, I don't want to do that anymore. And so she stopped. She's like, so I'm going to be more, I'm going to think about it differently because I don't want to continue like visually oppressing my language. And it could be part of that idea, what Visner was talking about, that like performance. So that one, because I think that's a question we get a lot as Native writers, is like, why aren't you writing in Nez Perce? Mm-hmm. Why aren't you writing in Navajo? And so part of it is, the context is like, so you're not authentic if you're not writing in your tribal language, right? But then it's sort of like, well, I can be, even if I'm using English, right? Because English now is my tribal language. And so that I don't need to have like the Navajo peppered in there. I can, but right, I'm not dependent on it in that way.
Yeah. Do we have one last question or comment? Yeah.
Test. All right. So first of all, thank you so much for like your time to just sharing your knowledge with us. So I'm definitely no poet. I like study engineering, so like
Oh, I love
be
it.
able to like learn about these like new topics like linguistic, like shape shifting and like sovereignty or like were all really interesting. So my question is just like, how do you think like your projects help bring awareness to like indigenous problems and issues to somebody that might not necessarily know too much about the history of like indigenous people?
Mm, yeah. And I think part of it is definitely with the context, right? I mean, there's so many layers around Indigenous history on what angle to kind of engage people in. And so one of the things I think, especially with of cartography, using those visual pieces, like really draw people. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is about language. And people are like, what? Like, why is this about language? Right. And then I mean, there's still a lot of explanation around why things are the way they are for kind of the general audience around that. But I think one of the things in terms of context that I like to talk about is privilege, power, and oppression. And that I think is also present in the writing, right? Around why is it that we're sort of lesser known within American literature, right? And why is it that when we're asked to contribute to something, it really is kind of for aesthetic qualities, right? And sort of that beauty kind of stuff on there. And I think we're starting to look at things a little differently. And so what I've done and I try to do is, and I think more of the other, more than I feel like the other Navajo writers that I've talked with, I'm really more interested in trying to engage with audience than they are. And sort of when we talk about like who we write for and why we write. And so I think part of that, so the cover artwork too, at least for my books, I did. And so that's always a conversation as well. So I don't think it's like more than, and also, I guess if you go back to that triangle where, because I've done so much work on dealing with intergenerational trauma, I think you could call me an Indian, or you could call me Native American, you could call me Navajo, and I can meet you on that level of that conversation and kind of say, oh, well, this is actually how I like to identify versus that, right? So, and I've seen some people who are just like done. They're like, I'm not going to respond to you if you call me this, which I totally get, right? So I think there's, I guess, multiple levels of that entry. And I have them in both books. But for some people who are really having, like, just want so much, I just say, read my first book, because it's actually like the essay in there is really biographical. So once you read it, then maybe we can have a conversation. But after, I mean, it's just harder. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you again.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.